You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyis with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make this show possible. Listeners, you can support us with a monthly subscription of as little as $5 at patreon.com/BQN. Today's topic is Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was an incredibly important part of the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century. He was born on the 17th of March in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He never knew his father and did not find out until adulthood that the woman he believed was his older sister was actually his mother. The family was solidly middle class due to the success of his grandfather's catering business. His grandmother was a Quaker and a charter member of the NAACP, influences that he acted upon early and continued to throughout his life. As a high school football player, he organized a demonstration at a hotel that refused to allow the black members of the team to stay. They did a similar thing at a restaurant that refused to serve the black players. He was also arrested at least once as a teenager for sitting in the whites-only section of a local movie theater. He attended Wilberforce College, an historically black college in Ohio, beginning in 1932, but was expelled in 1936 for organizing a student strike. He continued his studies at Cheyney State Teachers College and the City College of New York. While in college, he joined the Young Communist League, but left because he felt they were paying insufficient attention to race issues. After college, he was hired in the summer of 1941 by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and with fellow members A. Philip Randolph and A.J. Musty, planned a march on Washington, D.C. to demand desegregation of the defense industry. Randolph met with FDR to discuss the issue, and the president agreed that desegregation was needed. He issued an executive order that did so, thus making the march unnecessary, and so it was canceled. Rustin wanted to continue with the march, but changed the subject from desegregation of the defense industry to desegregation of the military, something that would not be required by executive order until 1948 and would not be completed until 1960. He organized early demonstrations to desegregate buses and was arrested and/or beaten by the police for this and other such work on more than one occasion. In 1942, he was involved in the creation of the Congress of Racial Equality, which advocated for civil rights with specifically nonviolent tactics. As a Quaker and a pacifist, Rustin refused to be drafted in 1942. He was offered alternative service, as was the standard for conscientious objectors in the Second World War, but refused this as well because it would still be work in support of war. He was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, but served only 26 months. In that time, he was first placed in the Ashland Federal Prison in Kentucky, where he organized protests among the prisoners about the segregated conditions. This prompted authorities to move him to the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, where he did the same thing. After the war, he and other members of CORE organized the Journey of Reconciliation to test the recent Supreme Court decision in Morgan v. Virginia that banned segregation on interstate buses. While doing this work, in 1947, he was arrested for and convicted of violating segregation laws in North Carolina, resulting in a sentence of 3 weeks working in a chain gang. The next year, he attended a conference on nonviolent resistance in India, and then spent a few years using what he'd learned to support anti-colonialist movements in Africa. In January of 1953, he was arrested in Pasadena, California on charges of sex perversion, the legal euphemism used at the time for illegal sodomy. The arrest, conviction, and a 60-day jail sentence outed him publicly. While he had not hidden his homosexuality, it had not been widely known to the public. From this point forward, some in the civil rights movement considered him a liability. He was forced to resign from the Fellowship of Reconciliation and was pushed into the background in other organizations. He worked with the War Resisters League for a few years, then joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his work in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. Rustin was instrumental in shifting Dr. King to a wholly pacifist approach. While he had always preached nonviolence, King had not been averse to demonstrators protecting themselves from attack in his earlier work. The two of them also organized the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As plans were being made for demonstrations related to the 1960 presidential election, Rustin's homosexuality and former, if brief, membership in the Communist Party caused some of his colleagues to fear he would become a distraction to the work. And so, despite his skill with organizing and complete dedication to the movement, King bowed to pressure to distance himself from Rustin when Representative Adam Clayton of New York threatened to tell the press that the two men were lovers. A planned march on the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles was also canceled to prevent such rumors from spreading, as well as other political considerations. Rustin voluntarily stepped away for the good of the cause. Where he could, he continued his civil rights work, but was now completely behind the scenes, no matter what organization. But in 1962, while planning a march on Washington, D.C. to commemorate the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, A. Philip Randolph remembered how useful Rustin had been with the planning for the canceled 1941 march. Their effort began relatively small until the attack on peaceful protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, which forced the Kennedy administration to work more publicly and more quickly on civil rights legislation, and also convinced Dr. King that the effort should be expanded to a nationwide strategy. The focus of the march shifted from simple commemoration to a push for social and economic justice, taking on the title of the March for Jobs and Freedom. Hoping for a showing of around 250,000 people, Randolph and Rustin set to work organizing everything from the pamphlets explaining the goals of the march, how people should get there, and even what they should bring for lunch, to the number of first aid stations and toilets that would be needed. They also had to make sure that the presenters' speeches stayed in line with the overall message, putting them at odds with some of the more vehement speakers. Rustin himself was the one to read the list of goals and demands to the crowd. The march was, of course, an overwhelming success and is now best known as the venue for Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, Rustin shifted his efforts toward labor issues. Working with the American Civil Liberties Union, he founded and directed the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which focused on economic and civil rights issues. He emphasized the need for unity across the working class, irrelevant of race. His shift toward economic equality was a natural outgrowth of the earlier movement. It made no difference if blacks had the legal right to sit at the lunch counters if they could not afford to eat there. He felt that working within the existing party system would be the most effective means to achieving this goal. As part of this affiliation, he made a point of publicly supporting Lyndon Johnson's policies about the containment of communism, also perhaps to further distance himself from his earlier affiliation with the party. He also continued his anti-colonialist work in Africa and with other minority and dispossessed groups worldwide. As he worked closely with the Democratic Party, some of his former colleagues accused him of being a sellout. He did not participate in gay activism until the early 1980s. He was encouraged by his partner, Walter Nagel, in part because the only way they could create a legal familial bond was for Rustin to adopt Nagel. He described the position of the LGBTQIA community of the time as the same as blacks prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and said that their treatment was the new measure of social change. Rustin died on the 24th of August in 1987 of a ruptured appendix. His influence on the civil rights movement was, until recently, largely forgotten in the popularly known history. His posthumous award of the Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama in 2013 and other efforts of recognition have returned him to his place in the narrative. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagyi Patreon patrons, Ed Chinevere, Laura Dell, Kris Hill, and Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagyis. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on Twitter at The Goddess Olivia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?